recorded. Okay, so, well, thanks for those that joined me. I think my name scared off everyone else, but so Chautauquas, I think it's a more interesting topic than you might think. You see the Chautauqua Lake. If you see the name Chautauqua, it might sound Native American, and it is. The lake in New York State. How many of you are already familiar with what a Chautauqua is? Some of you are, yeah, so a lot of you know. So there's a lake in New York State with a Native American name, Chautauqua Lake, and that is the site of the very first Chautauqua, the New York Chautauqua Assembly, which was organized in 1874 by a Methodist minister, and it got very, very, very popular, popular enough that more of these sprang up all over North America. I kind of jokingly refer to it as edutainment, because they didn't just do, I mean, it is certainly a Christian kind of revival style entity, but it also is, it's science demonstrations, it might be opera singing, it might be theater, it's just there's a lot going on. A lot of it is Christian-centered, but a lot of it isn't. And really, these were big, especially if you think like, you don't have electricity, so you don't have movies, you don't even have radio, you certainly don't have the internet. So this is something that's going to draw lots and lots of people, which is why these sprout up all over the country. So independent Chautauquas, as they were called, these things are sort of permanent fixtures, permanent facilities that are kind of grounded in one place, and they have their own buildings and all that. And again, they pop up, especially as the railroads begin to move across the country. So those are going to pop up all over America. The alternative to those, and incidentally I should add, with the more permanent Chautauquas, they still are going, right? The one in New York State is still going. There's one in Indiana over near Wawasee that's going. Maybe more than that in Indiana. I don't keep track, but they are still a thing. Obviously a little different than they were in 1874. But the other style are the circuit Chautauquas, or kind of colloquially tent Chautauquas. So this would be more of a traveling. As you can imagine, it's sort of like a circus, right? It's a sort of motorcade with a tent, with a group of tents, and people are traveling, and so they would come to town. So I'm sure, I haven't looked into, I'm sure Plymouth, Rochester, Culver had them, certainly well into the 1930s and beyond. These would pop up maybe even every year as just sort of like a temporary Chautauqua with the preaching and the other things that are just a variety of entertainment. Which brings us to Culver. And this is Henry Harrison Culver. So Henry Harrison Culver, as many of us may know, he's born in Ohio. He and his brothers set up shop in St. Louis, Missouri. There's their factory. And they begin in 1864 manufacturing stoves. Initially it's the Culver Brothers Stove Company, and then the Wrought Iron Range Company. And he's got a traveling sales force of more than 200 people. And he's really successful, right? He and his brothers are very successful. So. But he's getting ill and he's getting older, and by the 1880s, really the late 1870s, he's in kind of bad health. And so his doctor says, you really should retire somewhere shady and comfortable and all that. And he met his wife between here and Culver in the booming metropolis of Wolf Creek. I'm sure we've all stopped at Wolf Creek to get a burger. No, we haven't, because there's nothing there at all. It's just like a creek that goes across Muckshaw Road. But it was at one time a school and a mill, and etc. But so he meets his school teacher wife, Emily Jane Hand, there, and that motivates him to retire to the shores, the northeast shore of Lake Maxinkuckee, where he buys more than 300 acres. He's got a homestead that we at Culver Academy still use as a guest home across from the golf course there, and he's got all this land that's sitting there, and he's a bored businessman. So what does he do? He starts a Chautauqua. He buys 98 acres in the northeast corner of the lake, and then another 208 acres after that. And I'm quoting him, a good deal of this land was low and damp. And anybody who's been on the parade field at Culver knows that that's true, or been in the many flooded basements on the campus. But this is his Chautauqua. So he builds, in 1889, he's completed the Culver Park Assembly Chautauqua. So he builds this wood frame hotel, which anyone who's been at the Culver campus, that's exactly where main barrack sits, which is a little more confusing because it just got torn down and now rebuilt, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's location. And this water is not Lake Maxinkuckee. He's actually got a series of canals and lagoons that he's dug out to help drain all that water that he referenced. And so he builds that, and then he builds what's called a tabernacle. So in the sort of parlance of Chautauquas, a tabernacle is this outdoor kind of, I mean, it's not outdoors, it's a building, but it's kind of an airy, big auditorium type space, mostly for preaching and teaching and performing, that sort of thing. So he's got his Chautauqua in 1889. Oh, there's a lagoon, I already mentioned, yes. And just to reference it again, there's the same lagoon, and there's Main Barrack back there. It's a very early picture of Culver. Lest I forget, those lagoons are going to get filled in the 19-teens when Jens Jensen, the great outdoor landscape architect who's a collaborator with Frank Lloyd Wright, he visits the Culver campus and says, you know, these lagoons are really just muddy ditches, and you're going to get malaria because there's mosquitoes, so they're ugly, you know, and so at his suggestion, he really helps form up the lakeshore, the beautiful lakeshore there on the campus. So these are filled in the 19-teens, and that's a whole other story, but they are not there anymore. So the Culver Park Assembly opens in July of 1889. I don't know if you can see the names down at the bottom there. Well, we'll get back to those in just a second. And you see it runs from July 19th to August 1st of 1889. And there's a little drawing of it. Come on. Incidentally, this is the second page of his program for the Chautauqua. That's the Culver Homestead House. It's still there today. Those are actually whale jawbones. From a Maxinkuckee whale. No, they're actually they're from Nantucket. One of his sons went to Nantucket and brought home, for whatever reason, the whales of a jawbone. And so that was sort of the ceremonial entryway to the Culver homestead. Again, you can still go there. The jawbones are gone, but you can still see that house on the east shore of the lake. If anyone wants to know, we know where the jawbones went, but they're not around anymore. So this is the bulletin from that year of 1889. And again, I'm quoting, I don't mean to quote him, but anyway, Mr. Culver writes, I secured T. DeWitt Talmage of New York, Reverend Sam Jones of Georgia, and Dr. John Matthews of St. Louis, and had great crowds to hear them. Talmage was one of the most prominent religious leaders in the U.S. in the mid to late 19th century. He preached to crowds in England. For years, his sermons were published regularly in more than 3,000 journals. He is said to have reached 25 million readers. The Reverend Sam Jones is one of the most celebrated revivalists of the day. He's particularly, this is kind of interesting, he's particularly connected with the history of the Union Gospel Tabernacle, later renamed Ryman Auditorium. So if you know Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, that's connected with him. Nashville, Tennessee, not Indiana. So Grand Ole Opry, right? So, you know, there's a lot of rich history with these guys. They really are the superstar Christian preachers of their day. In the late 19th century, so it's kind of neat. He brings around 10,000 plus people to Culver by rail for this Chautauqua. You could come for a weekend, you could come for a week, you could stay for the whole thing. You know, the trains took you home to and fro, etc. Here's an actual photo of a little better photo of the hotel. Now, this is when it's later converted to Culver Military Academy's first building. You can see cadets in there, but this was the dining hall. So the dining room was in the lower level of the Chautauqua Hotel, and it became the Academy, Culver Military Academy's first dining hall, which we'll get to in a moment. The Tabernacle, a little better shot of it there, it's going to become the first gymnasium for the school, believe it or not. It's not really much of a gymnasium, but it's going to become the first gymnasium that the students use starting in 1894. And it's actually going to burn down in 1918. It was converted to a trunk room to just house cadet luggage and all that, but it's going to burn down in 1918. This is W.O. Osborne. He was the president for much of the 20th century of the State Exchange Bank in Culver. And he's just, you can see this quote, he had great preachers like Sam Jones and T. DeWitt Talmage. You know, you could have heard them singing for 10 miles. Big crowds attended the meetings and ate picnic dinners in the woods. They also got acquainted with the lake. But all the time, says W.O. Osborne, who knew Mr. Culver, he told his wife he was going to start a school here. He was the last man in the world you'd think would found a school. He was a manufacturer, and his mind ran that way. And that is an interesting thing about Henry Harrison Culver, is he was not, he was almost more of a blue-collar kind of guy. There's a story that after he opened the school, someone came looking for Henry Harrison Culver, and they found a guy digging a ditch in dirty work clothes, and he said, I'll go get him for you. So he led him over. Guy goes in, changes clothes, comes out in a suit and tie, and says, Harrison Culver. So he's, you know, Mr. Culver is really a more of a manufacturing guy, but he was a great businessman. And as we don't need to get too much into the history of Culver Military Academy, but he's great at who he brings in to lead that school. He brings in a young Virginia Military Institute graduate in 1897 named Lee Ginolette, who's going to be kind of the giant promoter of the school. He's going to bring in a classical scholar named Alexander Fleet, to be his superintendent very early on. So he's really brilliant at making the place work quite well, even though he himself wasn't an educator. So yes, we don't exactly know why he didn't stick with the Chautauqua business, because it obviously did well, at least in terms of numbers. He did convert the property itself briefly into an agricultural fairgrounds, particularly north of the actual Chautauqua space. So, you know, I don't have to get into all the detail, but some early athletic, usage by the school, it was actually where the agricultural fairgrounds were before, and it wasn't really an organized county fair like we have today that's located in Argus, but it was a pretty booming fair for several years after 1889. But in the fall of 1894, he opens Culver Military Academy. All boys at the time. It is what it sounds like. It's a military school. Not a lot of students that very first fall. You can see, though, there they are gathered at the old Chautauqua Hotel. And I have to credit my late great mentor, Bob Hartman, our former historian, for use of these little animated flames that he used in all his PowerPoints on campus, because there were a lot of fires on campus in the early part of the 20th century. And indeed, in February of 1895, more or less the entire school burns down, because the entire school was this one building, with the exception of the tabernacle / gymnasium. This is classrooms, this is barracks for the boys, this is the dining hall, as I mentioned, or mess hall as it was called, and it burns down. And what's really remarkable is that by September of the same year, so between February and September, he's got this 3-story brick, stone, and steel, as he liked to advertise it, main barrack building built. It's going to have a 4th story within the next decade added to it, but that was really remarkably quick work to have that building. And really, it's lasted. I mean, we did just tear it down, kind of bittersweet. We just tore it down last year because we're going to rebuild it to the same specs. But again, that water table problem in the basement and all that really wreaked havoc on the foundation. But it lasted almost 130 years. And it's interesting because I mentioned Alexander Fleet, the classical scholar. He was the head of and basically the owner of the Missouri Military Academy, which burned down in 1896, and he lost everything. So when he came to Culver to become the superintendent, he wouldn't work for a school that didn't have a brick building, because he didn't want to lose his school again,
sure.
To fire.
Sure.
So that's the first Chautauqua, and again, did pretty well. The second one actually lasted quite a bit longer, and it was located on the south side of today's town of Culver. So it's going to open in 1899, so really just a little bit less than 10 years later. The Maxinkuckee Assembly Chautauqua was purchased from M.G. Gould, as you can see on the map there, who received ownership from his father-in-law, Elder Foote, who was a Baptist preacher. The Lake Maxinkuckee Chautauqua Assembly was 26 acres, a lot of beautiful oak grove. There were, pools and marshland that they cleaned up, and they advertised that it was insured against malaria and mosquito pests. So they even had their own post office until 1905, long-distance telephone service. It was like having an iPad. And a number of cottages, a hotel, a large tabernacle. You can see the swimming pier here. The fun they have at the Maxinkuckee Assembly reads the caption in this photo of boys waiting near the assembly grounds, taken from the 1985 Maxinkuckee Art Annual. Come on.
Hiccup.
And this is we don't have the best quality pictures, but this was the tabernacle, again, where all the preaching took place. It was lay members of the Christian church that ran it, but it was broad and non-sectarian in its program. Known as the Maxinkuckee Assembly of the Christian Church. Again, it's really because of the Vandalia Railroad running from Terre Haute to South Bend, and then the crisscrossing railroad going east-west here, the Nickel Plate. People could get here from all over the country, and as we'll see in a moment, they did. Cottages were rented, tents were rented and could be pitched. Large delegations from Terre Haute and all the different cities along the rail lines came, including Indianapolis. You can see the program here from 1903. There was a summer school there with classes such as theology, history, literature, public speaking, and physical culture. The best platform talent was engaged, lecturers, readers, singers, and musical organizations, with occasional novelties usual to such assemblies. And just to give you an idea of kind of how much they were offering, this is more part of the program, lots of stuff. Lots and lots of stuff. They kept them busy.
I guess.
This is, very good. This is Professor Eli Miller. Oh, here he is. The president of the Chautauqua Assembly, who managed the music, and they had oratorios, and I won't go into all the detail, but this is the author of the song Maxinkuckee, a popular song with the intention of popularizing the Maxinkuckee Assembly. The refrain was, "Oh, let us go boating, go merrily floating, over the crystal wave we'll glide, and from care be free. Oh, here's a treasure, here's joy without measure. I'm so lucky, and fair Maxinkuckee's the place for me."
And you went too fast, Jeff. I didn't get to see the man's name.
Oh, sorry. It's fuzzy there. He is Frank Houston, Secretary of the Assembly.
Okay,
So
thank
he's
you.
the author. And again, you can just kind of get a sense. This is from Queen Esther. We don't have to go through all the detail, but they did pretty elaborate productions, right? I love this one. This guy is the Wizard of Electricity. This is in the year 2000. Reno Wellborn presented this. You can see it looks just like the year 2000 there. And this is another part of the offering, that they had. This is their program from 1901. Note the hotel there. That's going to factor in again in a moment. Again, just lots of stuff, lots of people coming in. And you can see this is a National Railway advertisement. And so you can go to Wawasee, Indiana, you can go to Boston, Massachusetts, Louisville, Kentucky, New York, or Maxinkuckee Assembly, Culver, Indiana. So it's a national destination, right?
Wow.
Which is kind of neat. I mean, the lake, really, once the railroad came in 1883, the lake itself was a pretty hot destination, figuratively and literally, because of the, you could come up on the train, get on the steamboats. So, there were 5,000 to 7,000 people coming every weekend anyway, but this became its own, own commodity. So, again, more. So what happens? What happens to the poor Maxinkuckee Assembly? I meant to mention, by the way, that one of the people that was booked to come was Carrie Nation. So I don't know if you know who Carrie Nation was. She was famous as the prohibitionist who would bust up beer kegs, wooden beer barrels with her axe. And I know, she was booked to come, got arrested for busting up a beer barrel with an axe, and didn't make it. So, we can't really say she, Carrie Nation slept here or anything like that. But she was going to. So, right as the thing is really escalating by 1907, things start to change, right? And one of the biggest changes, of course, is, there's a little caption, it's probably hard to read. You ought to be at Culver, Indiana. So what's happening, of course, the rail lines are getting less and less use. By the teens, roads are being paved, everybody's got a car. Trains are just kind of declining in use other than, they're still used, but really the boom is ending by this point. I mean, it's already the beginning of the end even by 1907. By the 19-teens, it's just done, with the paving of roads and all that. So 07 is the last year for the Maxinkuckee Assembly, and there's a whole long sort of sad story of its eventual bankruptcy, but that's the last year it actually functions. It's an interesting kind of little anecdotal side note, if you will. If you drive on the south end of Culver today, and it's been this way for a long time, you'll see some odd street names like Nueva Gorda, Prado, Obispo, Tampa, Peru Court. Names that don't fit northern Indiana. They might today, but nobody's using Spanish names in the early 20th century in northern Indiana. So, and that's really just because of this guy, J.O. Ferrier, who was a very prominent businessman on East Jefferson Street with his lumber yard. He and his wife made the long trek to Florida, which nobody did in those days, but he went to Florida in 1909, or by 1909, he bought up the whole assembly grounds property and he platted out the streets, and he named them after streets he'd seen in his visit to Florida, and he actually went to Cuba as well. So that's why Culver has these unusual Spanish names on the south end of its town. Sadly, the hotel did continue. For briefly, it was called the Maxinkuckee Inn, later the Ralston Hotel, and then a 1911 kitchen fire completely destroyed it. As you see the real video footage in color of that happening. So that's really the very last vestige of the old assembly grounds, which if you're familiar with Culver today, basically it started on the north at about Davis Street, and it went south to around the cemetery in Culver. So that whole section on the lakeside of South Main Street, that big section of multiple acres. So now, Chautauquas did continue. Chautauquas continued in Culver and elsewhere, as I mentioned, tent Chautauquas. I want to say maybe, I don't know if it was Marilyn who's sitting here that told me her memories of tent Chautauquas coming to Culver, but I've heard people who remember them coming, I think, into the 40s. So they were still around as kind of an annual thing. Now, when I think of Chautauquas, and I think of, I think of Winona Lake, which was not actually a Chautauqua proper. That was on Wawasee, as I mentioned, or near Wawasee. But I think of this man, Billy Sunday, who was a huge star a little bit later in this, than this, a little bit later than the beginning of the Chautauqua era. He's a really well-known baseball player in the late 1800s, and he becomes the Reverend Billy Graham of his day, right? In fact, a lot of people would say he's the predecessor of Billy Graham. He invents what's called the Sawdust Trail. He is this evangelist who goes all over the country and draws tens of thousands everywhere he goes. So why am I talking about him? Well, he ends up situating in Lake Winona, or at Winona Lake nearby, over by Warsaw, and his son attends Culver Military Academy. His son George. Poor George did not have a great time of it. He attended briefly, and this is an article from 1912 where they talk about him eloping, I think, to get married. And the last little couple of sentences: George tried schooling for a short time at the Culver Military Academy, but threw off the shackles of tyranny and beat on an outgoing freight one night. However, if the young man inherited his father's qualities, he will arrive. Well, yeah, he and a buddy jumped on the train, went out and got drunk, and so that was the end of his Culver career. Poor guy. He did have kind of a bad life. But and I always like to tell this story just because it's just one of those weird historical coincidences. So William Jennings Bryan, I think we know him. He was a presidential candidate and himself really a prominent sort of Christian advocate. He wasn't exactly an evangelist, but he was really a big superstar of his day as well. And I believe that there's a picture here of him being in Plymouth, somewhere in this building. I know I've seen it. There's a picture of him stopping in Plymouth. I don't know when, but his son, I have him circled up there, his son, William Jr., was a 1912 graduate of the Culver Naval School. And so William Jennings Bryan made several trips to Culver and lectured to the Corps of Cadets and naval midshipmen. So he has this Culver connection. Well, here's another Culver connection, and the two are going to come together. Some of you probably know this story. In 1920, I mentioned W. Osborne, the State Exchange Bank, very successful bank, one of the most successful banks in Indiana, and it's robbed by Chicago gangsters in 1920. That's a whole other program unto itself. But during the robbery, a businessman named Jacob Sane, who's running a dry goods store, like you did in those days, gets out his gun and starts shooting at the bank robbers. And unfortunately, all these businessmen are doing this. It's not just him. There's several of them just shooting at the bank robbers, and he is shot and killed by the bank robbers. Interestingly, if you ever come see me at the Culver Academy's museum in downtown Culver, that's where his store was. So he was shot basically on that site. And it was, of course, extremely, controversial isn't the word. It enraged the people of Culver enough that when the robbers were taken to Plymouth here to jail, there was fear that they'd be lynched by a lynch mob. So they moved the whole operation, which is to say they jailed them in Warsaw, and they ended up having their trial at the Kosciuszko County Courthouse. So who did these guys pick to defend them but a prominent Chicago attorney named Clarence Darrow? So if you know Clarence Darrow, by the way, he considered the trial a win because they didn't get the death penalty. They were clearly guilty. There was no question about that. But so Darrow is going to square off against William Jennings Bryan in the famous 1920 Scopes monkey trial, which is, again, it kind of ties in with this larger story. It's not Chautauqua proper, but it ties in with this larger story of kind of a sort of a Chautauqua-like Christian approach to things up against the theory of evolution in the public school system in Tennessee. So if you're familiar with that story, it's made into a movie, Inherit the Wind, great movie, not historically accurate movie in many, many ways, but it is a great movie, with Spencer Tracy and Gene Kelly. So it's just interesting that these two figures who were part of this really hugely historically significant event in 20th century history in America also had ties here to Marshall County and to Culver. So even if the shocking thing's remote, but I'm going to throw it in because and that is what I have, unless you have questions. You did have some questions.
I want to know what happened to the whale bones. Everybody does, don't
What
they?
happened to the? That's what really everybody wants to know. Yeah, no. So they were removed, and I'm not sure exactly when, but by the 30s, they were at the Woodcraft camp.
Oh.
Which is the kind of Boy Scouty, 9 to 14-year-old kids camp on the Culver campus. So the old pictures show them in front of the Log Cabin Museum, which still exists. And the thing is, I mentioned Bob Hartman. He and I one day called the former camp director, Pete Trone, and said, "What happened to those whale jawbones?" Because there were rumors. And Pete said, "Oh, well, campers would take a piece of the jawbone at the end of the summer as a little memento. And after whatever 10 years, there's nothing left but this pile of like bone chips." So yeah, sadly they just disintegrated basically. So yeah, but if you go to, I think a tree fell since then, but if you go where the Culver homestead is down on the lake area, you can see where they were mounted, and you can actually see there's a little bit of the jawbone left in the kind of mounting pillars there, the stone pillars. So yeah.
A group like 10,000 would show up. Where would they stay, and what are the arrangements for taking care of them?
Sure. Yeah, that's why the larger operations like that would make sure they had cabins and tents, and Culver always had that problem, even without the Chautauquas, with the 5,000 to 7,000 coming, which is why there were not only were there a lot of hotels. I have a whole separate talk on hotels of Culver. Some of them were quite elaborate. Is that me? No, I don't think it's me. Some of them were quite elaborate, but there were a lot of cottages on the lake that rented out for people to stay in. So yeah, I think it was a mixture of local hotels, cottages, and then the Chautauqua sites made sure they tried to accommodate the numbers that they hoped to get with their tents and cabins. So
Did they have big cafeterias, or?
I assume they did. I'm assuming that when Mr. Culver built the hotel, what became the mess hall for the cadets probably was already an outfitted kitchen. Of course, he was in that business. Not only did the Culver family sell these individual stoves, you might sell, he had the sales force that went around in horse and buggies and trains and had these little sample stoves, and then they'd ship you a stove by train. But they also did mass production kitchenware. So they had huge hotel stoves and every implement you could want for a restaurant or hotel. So that was a big part of their business as well. So yeah.
Were they cooking stoves or heating stoves also?
I think they only ever did cooking stoves.
Okay.
They also got in the clock business too.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
Do you in Culver have any of the sample stoves or stoves?
Dude, they're cool. Yeah. We have the sample stoves. If you've been in the museum, we have one. They look sort of like 19th century easy bake ovens. They're like little things. And then we have the original trunk. They were just it was bulky, but they just carried them around in a trunk, and they'd open them up and show the farm wife. There were very strict rules about how you interacted with the wife, your salesman, and all that. And you took the whole thing along on the train or the buggy, and then when they ordered one, you had it shipped. It's interesting, they had plainer versions for the Amish, because these are all wood stoves, but you could get the more enameled, elaborate. If you come to the museum, anybody come take a look, because we have, they're really beautiful. They're almost kind of an art unto themselves, right? And not only were they beautiful, but their function was just amazing in the sense that and you see this, of course, before electricity and et cetera. People knew how to utilize every facet of the energy that they use. So they had a capacity to save the ashes to make soap. They had a bread warmer over here, because if you're cooking anyway, you're warming bread, and you're also, let's have some water boiling while we have a fire going anyway. So, you know, there's all these little nooks and crannies that facilitated multiple uses from just cooking a meal, you know. So they were really, I think they're neat they're fascinating, you know, instruments to look at. Nowadays we don't need to do that, so we have a little separate thing for everything, but, yeah.
What was the heat source?
Wood, usually
Oh,
wood.
I was thinking coal, all right.
Yeah, coal was used more for home heating.
Oh, okay.
And somebody who knows more about it than me could say why, but but yes, it was wood heat. And of course, they weren't the only, you know, everybody needed stoves, so a lot of people making stoves, but they were successful, and their big hook was wrought iron. They talked about how strong wrought iron was, and it would never, you know, that was kind of it would never deteriorate, and it could take any heat. And we actually have their first stove from 1864 on display at the museum, which is kind of neat. It's the simplest of all the many stoves they made, of course, but it's kind of cool.
What are your hours, Jeff, at the museum?
Well, that's a loaded question. We have not been able to reopen recently with, there's a whole long story there, staffing and all that, retail. I'll just say I'm there every day, pretty much, so until we get regular hours back, it's you know, shoot me an email, museum@culver.org, or just call the Academy switchboard and they'll connect you to me. We'll definitely get you in, or just knock on the door. I wouldn't want you to make a special trip in case I don't hear you, but I am there every day. We'll show you, we'll give you the behind the scenes tour of all the stoves that we have, so, yeah.
This is kind of off topic, but my in-laws came in 1907 to Burr Oak, the Burr Oak grocery store. Where would I find information about why they came from Guernsey, Indiana? They were store owners down there too.
Yeah, well, one, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the State Library has the full run.
Okay.
Well, it's not the full run, it's 1903 through 63, the Culver Citizens. And a lot of times they'd write about things like that. I don't know if,
We have that.
yeah, I was gonna say, you all have,
Yeah.
I can't swear that we have just exactly that piece of information,
Okay,
but we have the newspapers on microfilm, and lots of times we have family files
okay,
that we've just accumulated bits and pieces.
okay.
So you could start here.
All right, because Mike Boyce, in one of his articles in the last year, we as a family never knew when the fire happened, and that was 1924, he said. And so the store you see today is the remake.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there is
Well,
an
there's a fire
absolute-
story.
Yeah, that's a fire story.
yeah.
There is so much information here, and we have researchers that are very happy to help you
Okay.
find things, and it's an interesting process, but you'd be shocked at the amount of records that we actually have here that we can reference for you.
Yeah, we have all the newspapers from
Yeah.
all over the county for as far
Yeah.
back as we can go.
Yeah,
And
okay.
it's possible that online database would have the newspaper from where they came from. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know,
Could be.
they don't have all the papers in Indiana, but they have some. I mean, quite a few. So, yeah,
Well,
Yeah,
the
we were in
family
Guernsey.
folklore is they came in Huckster wagon,
sure.
and Guernsey, Indiana's on your way to West Lafayette.
Okay.
I
Might have
can't
something to
imagine.
do with the railroad as well.
I'm wondering too, in the gravel pit.
Lots of things, communities sprung up or grew
Mhm.
because the railroad chose to go through those communities.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when the railroad came through, that meant opportunity for new businesses.
Oh, sure.
So
Sure,
it's possible, that's why.
In
okay.
fact, it's interesting, the next stop down the line in Hibbard is where the Academy cadets would get off to be picked up to go to, if they were coming from the west.
Right, because that's where the Vandalia would pick them up north to south.
Yeah, and they, more typically, I don't know if the Vandalia stopped at Hibbard, but they'd send a car from the campus to pick them up at the Hibbard station.
Oh, is that right?
Vandalia stopped passenger service in
My dad.
1947, I believe.
Her dad.
But they did run special trains for the
Oh,
academy.
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And
Wonderful.
Till sometime in the 50s, I can't tell
But
you exactly.
if you were stopping in Hibbard as a cadet, you would usually get picked up by a car rather than, I mean, you couldn't get on the train that easily necessarily, could you, from the Vandalia.
Later on, they take a taxi, they had Jack's Taxi Service that
Tom
they
Walker.
met all trains in Hibbard.
Yeah. And apparently Marilyn's father did that.
Marilyn's father did
My
that.
father would pick him up at the Hibbard and take him back to the academy.
Yeah, there you go, yeah.
Cool.
That's where all the cadets got sick.
Oh, yeah, that's right, the Vomit Express, yeah. 1949, I can't, 6, somewhere, yeah.
You mentioned Winona and Wawasee, Chautauqua. Did Rome City or Sylvan Lake, Chautauqua ever, is that one you've seen pop up?
I don't know much about them. I mean, to be honest, the Wawasee one is in my mind more because it's still, I think it's still going. I know that it or at least it got revived. I mean, I don't know the full history of it, but, it's one of the few in Indiana that sort of kind of continued or restarted or whatever. But, yeah, I mean, I
know,
just
I
don't know.
lived on Sylvan Lake in the 70s, and they tried to revive the Chautauquas from, I don't know when the Chautauquas would have been, but they had Chautauqua days for several years, like the
Sure.
Memorial thing. But I've always been curious more about that.
Yeah, no, that's sorry. That isn't, that'd be interesting to look into.
It was the same type thing, the train would come from north-south,
Mhm.
and bring thousands of people.
Even in the 70s, or you mean,
No,
they were throwing them out,
They
okay,
were-
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
prior to that, I don't know what the dates.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I'm sure there's a whole other interesting talk to be had about, because I think there might be one in southern Indiana that has tried to revive itself as well. It's obviously a really kind of niche thing today, as opposed to then when it was really the only game in town in many ways, as far as just something to do, something interesting. And you think about, people would go, think about the Lincoln Douglas debates. People, including school children, would sit there for 8 hours. They might break for lunch, and they'd listen to these guys talk. And they would think they had a great time, it's really, can you imagine now, in the days of YouTube and TikTok, we're lucky to get 8 minutes.
Well, I don't know if it's tongue in cheek, but Jonah and the whale, biblical, Chautauquas.
Oh, the whales, the jawbones.
The
I think they
jawbone.
make some reference to that in the
Oh,
literature,
really?
actually, just as, yeah, I think there might even be a little cartoon of Jonah and the
Yeah.
whales in one of the.
What, is there any connection between the Culver Inn that was at the one Chautauqua and?
They called it, there's some evidence that they called that hotel the Maxinkuckee Inn, which is weird because the Culver Inn's earlier name was the Maxinkuckee Inn. So if those of you aren't familiar, it was actually a Plymouth person who ran the Palmer House, which is today on the Culver Academy's campus, but then it wasn't. It was on kind of this, just on along the lake shore there on the campus. But yeah, it was the Palmer House, goes back to the 1870s, and then it becomes the Maxinkuckee Inn in the 30s when the Culver family bought it, and then it became the Culver Inn in the 50s. So I don't think there's any connection, just somebody, Maxinkuckee Inn seemed like a logical name, and it predated the naming of the Culver Inn as Maxinkuckee Inn. It's kind of funny because part of one subset of that building was the Shack. It was a really popular burger kind of hangout, and the whole thing got torn down, and just in the last few years, the alums missed it enough that they rebuilt the Shack with the same siding, and actually the exact same wood paneling is inside it. It was preserved in the old building. But yeah, it's even got an old-fashioned phone booth, a jukebox.
Where did they build that new shack at?
It's pretty close to where the old one was, but not exactly. It's a little bit set back, I want to say.
A little bit west of the.
A little bit west.
Oh, the library, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, because there's that cement walkway that went out to the pier, and it's not quite in relation to that as it was in the original building, but it's set back a little further.
Yeah.
But it looks like a piece of the old shack, kind of. Yeah.
So on the south side of Culver then, it was in an assembly? Did they actually build like cottages for people to stay in?
They did, yeah.
It all belonged to the assembly?
Yeah, the hotel was pretty large, and you saw the pictures of it, and it was right along the lake shore, just south of Davis Street, in today's Culver. And then but they built cabins. They had a whole preponderance of cabins, and there were other hotels in town that did a similar thing, but they didn't have the Chautauqua. But yeah, there were a number of cabins, and I mean, we don't have a full sense of it. I don't think there's good full range picture, but, tents, sites for tents and material for tents. And I don't know if you could pitch your own tent, I'm guessing you could in certain spots, but yeah, they had that whole property and outfit. Like I said, they were a train stop and their own post office as well, which is kind of
Wow.
pretty elaborate.
Post office, not called Culver then, they have a separate name?
I don't know if it was just a satellite post office or if it, I don't think it had its own zip code or anything. Well, it didn't have zip codes then, but I don't think it had its own, I don't know, to be honest. Good question.
Didn't have
They
its
just
own
bragged
zip
about
code.
having a post office. What's that?
I said, didn't have its own zip code.
No, they did not.
That's a
No.
long way forward.
No.
It's pretty amazing to think about the town of Culver being able to accommodate that number of people in terms of, food.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
other kinds of, I mean,
Exactly.
they'd have to have a whole staff of grocers and doctors and.
Right.
It's just amazing to think about.
Yeah, they had to, and I assume trains were the answer to all of that. They brought in food from,
Yeah,
from
must have been.
everywhere. Because if you think about the academy even, so it's functioning simultaneously and it's feeding, at that time it wasn't 800 kids like it is today, but it's still feeding 500 or 600 people if you count the faculty every day. I remember seeing an article, the Newman family were really prominent dairy folks in the Culver area, and they, how many hundreds of gallons a day, there were a week they would bring in a week for the cadets, back in those days. But yeah, and it's funny, of course, if you've looked at old newspapers, you see that you get news of the town, news of the county, news of the state, news of the world, the country, and then the world, and you go, why is all this in my local paper? But think of what it took to get a South Bend paper down here, or a New York paper, or something like that. I mean, you have to come, somebody has to get it here, so you print all that news in your local paper, because that's really the most efficient way to get it, It's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, there used to be like fishing cabins. Were those part of that were on that south side, were they? I think it was like maybe the southwest side, there was a line of them, were they part of that Chautauqua? Or,
I think on the southwest side.
well, maybe I'm screwed up.
Because there are some that were, until recently, there were still a few next to the root beer stand.
Yeah.
On the property, there were these little fishing cabins.
Yeah,
and
they just
there's-
came down this year.
Yeah, they just got torn down.
Yeah, I thought there were some
Never
others
considered them fishing
around.
cabins,
What now?
cabins.
Yeah,
I don't
People
know.
would live in those small houses
I
all
would think.
summer.
okay.
Anybody,
Do you mean
Fishing
between the
cabin?
railroad and the lake shore?
No,
Okay.
as where Pinders used to be,
yeah.
and I think before you got to the cemetery, maybe some in there's only like 3 or 4
I wonder.
that I.
Right along the lake, you think, or?
Yeah,
Because that's where Davis
Oh,
Street
yeah,
is.
I remember that. They were down they were down the
Right.
hill.
Oh,
Uh,
down in
like-
that sort of pit, that
Yeah.
dip.
Yeah,
Where the
and there
ice house
were,
used to be.
yes, there were. I remember
Oh,
that when I first
interesting.
got to Culver, yeah.
That would totally make sense. That's very interesting.
There weren't
that's
many
a good
there,
question.
just a couple.
Just a
here.
couple,
I don't
yeah,
know.
because it was the 80s.
You mentioned Obispo, and I
They
know
were squatters.
25 years ago,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
there were some rental homes there, which obviously in Culver on the lake, near the lake, are hard to
Mhm.
find, but, that basically appeared to me as been more cottage to begin with,
right.
and then over the years been remodeled or something. But
Yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking if that's the area you're talking, cottages, maybe even the size of a home.
Could be. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I've seen much on what they kept.
Yeah, I don't
in
think
the hotel,
I
but
don't think these were all that big.
cabins are an interesting
But I'm
thought. And
thinking-
that south end of Culver used to be a little. It just was a more. Maybe a good way to put it is a more humble part of town. It was a little smaller houses, a little less ostentatious, and of course that's getting very gentrified now along the rest of the town, for lack of a better term. Everything in Culver is getting expensive, but those houses along the lake on the south side used to be not terribly valuable. They were just, wasn't a desirable part of town, and now everywhere in town is desirable. So,
My friend Dolores, her mother and father came out of South Bend on the south side and bought it for $4,800. And the cottage is still there with family, of course.
yeah.
But, What
Yeah.
today? We.
Yeah, I think you need a few million in your pocket to get a lot.
Oh, my.
It's crazy.
And tear them down, makes me sick.
Crazy. Yeah. I am gonna put in a plug before I forget, the 16th of September, for the history-minded, well, someone sitting here is gonna be part of it. The Historical Society is partnering up with the library in Culver to have a cemetery. It's a cemetery walk, but this year, for anybody who's gone before, you don't really have to, you know, people were struggling a little bit with the walking part of it, so it's gonna be in the cemetery, but we're portraying 5 people from the Culver area who have interesting stories, from a local school teacher to former superintendent of the academy, former band director of the academy, one of the black staff at the academy who went on to, whose son went on to be one of the first integrated basketball players in high school in Indiana. Just, you know, some interesting, I'm forgetting who all we do. But anyway, interesting folks. So yeah, it's free on the 16th from 1 to like 2-ish.
1 to 2-ish?
Ish. Well, because again, we used to do it in rotation where you
Yeah,
walk
you're not
around and
doing the
we're
walk.
in costume and we talk, and now it just got to be a lot, so
Okay.
we'll just have one performance from each person, and, yeah. So,
I like the name of it, Stories and
Stories
Stones.
and Stones.
Yeah, that's pretty
Miss
cool.
Louise.
Is
Sorry.
there a certain
Bless
place-
you.
Is there a certain place where they do that? Well, it's in the cemetery, they're going
So any other questions, thoughts, additions?
to probably put you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks for coming.